Good morning, U.S. history. It is Thursday, April 30th, and today I'm going to be reading from this book, Man Killer, A Chief and Her People. This is the autobiography of Wilma Mankiller, who was the longtime principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. She died several years ago. This book was published, I believe, in 1993. My copy, which was a gift from one of my sisters, is autographed by both Chief Mankiller herself and Michael Wallace, her co-author here. I'm going to be reading a fair amount out of this book, so get settled in. All you got to do is listen. She's talking about here where I'm starting, the fact that she had been kind of wild as a teenager. Her parents had kind of given up on the idea of taming her a little bit and sent her to live with some relatives, and she was looking for something to kind of give her life purpose. She was moving toward being something of a Native American activist, but didn't really know how. And then here in 1969, along comes the occupation of Alcatraz, which gives her that focus. So I'll start here, and then I'm going to skip ahead several pages. Then something happened that gave me the focus I was searching for. It all started in November of 1969, when a group of Native Americans representing more than 20 tribes seized a deserted island in the midst of San Francisco's glittering bay. Citing a forgotten clause in treaty agreements that said that any unused federal lands must revert to Indian use, they took over the 12-acre island to attract attention to the government's gross mistreatment of generations of Native people. They did it to remind the whites that the land was ours before it was theirs. Maybe the Nunahi, those immortals from the old story, had come to this place to help not only the Cherokees, but all other Native people. Maybe those immortals would dwell there until the balance was returned. The name of the island is Alcatraz. It changed me forever. Skipping ahead. Okay, giving a little bit of the background of the island of Alcatraz. In the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the city jail population was shipped to Alcatraz for safekeeping. During World War I, conscientious objectors sent from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, took up residence in the island's honeycomb of cell blocks. Then in 1933, when the Army had no use for the place, Alcatraz was transferred to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. It was transformed into a high-security penitentiary to house the nation's most incorrigible convicts, those who were regarded as being monstrous, depraved, and beyond all redemption. The first batch arrived in the autumn of 1934. Celebrity inmates included Al Capone, Alvin Karpis, Machine Gun Kelly, and Robert Stroud, the famous Birdman of Alcatraz. They were well known to the outside world, but like all the others on The Rock, that's the nickname for Alcatraz, as Alcatraz was commonly called, they were given no special treatment. They had no recreation, no rehabilitation. Most inmates never had a visitor. They spent an average of 16 to 23 hours each day in a cell that measured only 5 feet by 9 feet. Punishment for the slightest violation was immediate and severe. Swift currents of frigid bay water made escape practically impossible, although some convicts who became desperate enough tried to reach the mainland. 3 who supposedly escaped the island were never heard of again. Once a sanctuary for gulls and pelicans, Alcatraz had become an inhumane warehouse for the living dead. It was an island of hate. Because of mounting financial problems and public pressure, Attorney General Robert Kennedy ordered the federal prison to be closed in 1963. For a year after the last inmate was removed, Alcatraz sat like an aging derelict surrounded by water, a symbol of past punishment and acts of brute force. Visitors to San Francisco stood on Fisherman's Wharf and gazed at the rock. Some of them circled it in tour boats. In the dying sunlight, when the fog moved in, it seemed to be only a mirage. The island was no longer as it had been for centuries before, when free-spirited native people stopped there as nature's guests. On a brisk November day in 1969, it was on this ancient island of mean rock and ruined cell blocks that Native Americans made a stand. Our time in the sun had arrived. There had been a few victories for Native people earlier in the decade, when the winds of change came with the Civil Rights Movement, and the mood of the nation shifted. Slowly, ever so slowly, it seemed that the white population was beginning to understand that Native Americans also had concerns and needs. By the early 60s, the tribal termination policy had been fully discredited. The suffering of tribes that had been obliged to participate became apparent. Okay, we've got a couple of quotes. During the present century, we have been moving steadily away from all the pervasive paternalism of the 1880s and 90s toward a more wholesome respect for the human dignity of individual Indians, as well as the values of age-old tribal cultures. This is by a quote from Phileo Nash, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, made on December 6, 1962. And then, of course, a famous line from Dr. King, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." And that's from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. A significant piece of progressive legislation during that decade was the Economic Opportunity Act of 1965. This new law allowed Native American organizations and tribes to bypass the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, while they planned, developed, and implemented their own social, educational, and economic initiatives. For some Native communities and reservations, it was the beginning of economic self-determination. The passage of more reform legislation and judicial action soon followed. Then on March 6, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson, inspired by promises made in the Kennedy years, delivered the first message to Congress on Native American affairs in more than a century. He spoke of providing Native people with the freedom to, and I quote, "remain in their homelands if they choose without surrendering their dignity, an opportunity to move to the towns and cities of America if they choose, equipped with the skills to live in equality and dignity." Johnson pointed out that the housing situation for most Native people was inadequate. He noted that the unemployment among Native people had reached an astonishing 40%, and only half of our youngsters graduated from high school. He called us the Forgotten Americans. He stressed that instead of more paternalistic practices, the federal government needed to allow freedom of choice and to protect, quote, "the rights of the first Americans to remain Indians while exercising their rights as Americans." Congress responded by passing the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, which brought further federal intervention into tribal governments and courts. Ostensibly, the act extended the protection of the United States Bill of Rights to Native Americans, but mostly as those rights related to citizens under tribal governments, not the government of the United States. The wheels of bureaucracy never turn fast enough. Some elements of the bill were not legislated for more than a decade. Individual Native Americans secured the promise of new rights in the 1960s, but it took many more legal triumphs in the 1970s to win completely the right of self-government that we were so anxious to obtain. Federal Indian policy still had a long way to go. Endless delays increased our anger and frustration. Before any balance or harmony could be achieved, the archaic federal system that dominated our lives had to be fully rehabilitated. That reform needed to come from within. We wanted to make sure that the government knew this simple fact and that we had its undivided attention. Native American activism became more militant for many of those reasons. That is why the Native protests and marches in the 1960s were so important. That is why Native people seized Alcatraz. And again, you can contrast this with, on the one hand, Dr. King's commitment to nonviolent civil disobedience, and on the other hand, you have AIM's willingness to arm themselves at Wounded Knee. Sorry, I couldn't think of the name there for a second. Okay, the takeover of the island had been under consideration for some time. In 1964, just 1 year after the Alcatraz prison operations had been halted, 5 Sioux people living in the Bay Area had made a run at it. Dressed in their full tribal regalia, they landed on Alcatraz and claimed title to the island for their people. Federal marshals quickly moved in, and the squatters were forced to leave. During the years following that first takeover attempt, San Francisco's Board of Supervisors was deluged by proposals for commercial developments on Alcatraz. They included resort hotels, patriotic memorials, public parks, and gambling casinos. One party suggested turning the island into a cemetery. Of the more than 500 schemes the city officials reviewed, the one that caught the officials' collective eye was from Texas oil tycoon Lamar Hunt. He offered to pay a reported $2 million for the island in hopes of erecting a shopping and tourist complex, complete with manicured gardens, an underground space museum, and a futuristic tower topped by a revolving restaurant. Hunt said he would preserve the main cell blocks for tourists' enjoyment. In late September of 1969, the supervisors gave Hunt's proposal their stamp of approval. That action incensed our local Native American community, especially those involved with the Bay Area United Native American Council and others associated with the American Indian Center. Both of those entities had helped to sponsor the failed occupation of the island in 1964. Alcatraz still had a great symbolic value. Almost immediately, planning got underway to launch another occupation. The target date was the summer of 1970. Before a preliminary course of action could be considered, more disaster struck. On the evening of October 28, 1969, a four-alarm fire of mysterious origin gutted our beloved American Indian Center building in the Mission District. For almost a dozen years, this center had been a home away from home for many of us, perhaps for as many as 30,000 Native people. Just weeks after the fire, while Alcatraz was returning to the headlines, government officials began to scramble for ways to placate us. They offered available space at the Presidio, the sprawling U.S. military reservation, as a perfect spot for the reestablishment of the Indian Center. I suppose they did not realize the irony of Native Americans retreating to an army fort. The offer was declined, and a temporary center was soon established elsewhere in the Mission District. Although our original building, its entire physical structure, had been decimated, the spirit of the Indian Center would not be destroyed. The fire had a galvanizing effect on everyone in the local Native American community. Time was of the essence. A statement had to be delivered. It would require action and not mere words. We could not sit in the ashes and weep. We had to pick ourselves up and go on. We could not afford to wait for the next summer. The occupation of Alcatraz had to occur as soon as possible, and it did. Okay, so from Mankiller, A Chief and Her People, this was one of the big galvanizing events of Wilma Mankiller's life, and one of the things that led directly to her becoming the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, to which my wife belongs. And of course, here in Claremore, we are within the Cherokee Nation. Tulsa, I believe, is Osage Nation.
No, Creek.
Creek Nation. Osage Nation's further west. But anyway, hope you all are well and kind of think about these things. We're going to talk about some of this tomorrow in our Zoom meeting. Hope everyone's well today, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.